Hello, very good morning, my colleagues and good ladies and gentlemen. Shall we start this session? And this session will be focusing on the global context and research on religious persecution. Unfortunately, we are focused on persecution. Yeah. I'm Fort Futelio from Taiwan Foundation for Democracy and the current president, and I'm also an international human rights law professor. I'm very honored and I'm glad to be the moderator for this session. At this session, we have several distinguished speakers, and then I will try to very brief introduce them to you, and I'll try to give the floor to each speakers. And could I invite all the speakers to limit your speech within 12 minutes? Yeah, because we have a limited time. So may I try to introduce the first speaker, Mr. Eugene Yap. Mr. Yap, he holds a Bachelor of Laws degree from University of London and also a Master in Christian Studies. And he's now a Senior Fellow of the Religious Freedom Institute of the South and the Southeast Asia team and the Program Consultant for the Coalition of Civil Society Organization in Malaysia. That is the first speaker. And our second speaker will be Mr. Andrew Koo. Mr. Koo graduated from King's College London in Law and History and the Philosophy of Religion. And he has been practicing law in Malaysia for quite a long time, and probably more than 24 or 25 years. And he has presented the Malaysia Human Rights Commission, Suhakang, and also including several organizations, including the Malaysia Bar and the others, before the Federal Court, Court of Appeal, and the High Court in election position, and so on. Yeah. And our third speaker will be Ms. Tina Murford. And she is a Deputy Director of Research and Policy at the U.S. Commission of International Religious Freedom. And Ms. Murford has worked on and studied international human rights law and democracy for more than a decade. Mr. Ford holds a Master of Science in Comparative Politics from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and has Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Binghamton University. And we also have the fourth speaker, Attorney Tong Wenxin. Ms. Tong has been working to advocate for Falun Gong in China and the CCP's live organ harvesting crime. And she currently participates in the research of the Xinjiang re-education camp and the medical community's abuse of technology for live organ harvesting. And we also have her counterpart, from a gentleman from organ harvesting organizations, will be share the views with us. Yeah. And we also have a discussion. Mr. Benedict Rogers. Mr. Rogers is a human rights activist and a writer specializing in Asia, particularly Burma, Indonesia, China, and North Korea. He is East Asia team leader at the International Human Rights Organization, CSW. And he is also a co-founder and the deputy chair of the UK Conservative Party Human Rights Commissions. And he has MA in China Studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And by coincidence, I'm also educated in UK. So we have quite many people at this session educated in England, especially. So without further ado, could I invite the first speaker, Mr. Yap, to speak? Yeah, thank you.
Good morning, and thank you very much for having me here. Firstly, I want to thank Bob Fu. I think it's when we were in March together here in Taiwan, of course in Taipei at that time. Bob invited me because we talk about almost the same subject, and so this morning I'm thankful that I'm here this morning. And to the wonderful co-sponsors, thank you for having this conference. Yesterday, we heard a lot about China. We heard a little bit more about the Rohingya situation in the Rakhine and, of course, Burma the situation. We heard a little bit more about Southeast Asia, South Asia, India, Pakistan, but very little about Sri Lanka. This morning, I propose not to take up that discussion from that angle, but to rather add to the discussion on what was missing yesterday, and that is the area of the critical area and developing issues relating to the Muslim world. That is an important subject that we did not take up yesterday. So this morning I want to speak a little bit about the issues relating to the Muslim world, in particular the critical issues surrounding the Muslim world and how it affects religious freedom. We heard from our brother on the critical problems from the Boko Haram in Nigeria. But Nigeria is not the only country that is within the Muslim world that is facing issues in relating to religious freedom. Even as we speak, we have Yemen, for example. The bombardment from Saudi and the war with Saudi is causing sufferings to the people in Yemen. Then we have the impending so-called US-Iran war, which is causing jittery among the Muslim world. We also have the ever-persisting problem of the Palestine issues. Certain segment of the Palestine area, Muslims, they are also suffering, and they also do not have religious freedom. And of course, I understand that if we talk about Palestine, we have to talk about the Intifada, but I'm not going to go into that. It's a complex issue, but merely to highlight that within the Muslim world itself, religious freedom is a problem. Yesterday morning, we heard from Commissioner Nadine, who actually referred to Saudi Arabia. And I was particularly interested in the remark that she says that if you go to Saudi, you will see women driving today. Yes, but deep down underneath, there is no religious freedom. Churches are not, there's no places of worship that's coming up. And for the Muslim world, when it comes to the issues of religious freedom, the litmus test is really whether any Muslim community or whether the Muslim institution, whether they will accept or they will do away with the apostasy laws. You will find that within the Muslim world, apostasy, blasphemy is a real big issue. So with this simple setting up of the global context in relation to the Muslim world, I propose to now just go into three critical areas which I think the global community and those of us who are advocates and defenders of religious freedom must actually focus on if we are talking about how we can bring intervention programs, how we can help the Muslim world to advance religious freedom. Three critical areas, and very briefly, and then we can take the discussion from here. Firstly, it's the basis of religious freedom. While many of us here as advocates and defenders of religious freedom, we will quote the Article 18 of the UNDHR, Article 18 of the ICCPR, and say that, well, everyone has a right to manifest his religion, including the change of religion, and etc., etc. The majority in the Muslim world will not accept this. Now, I'm not questioning these provisions in the international covenants and instruments. That is something that we have come to accept after long struggle. But I'm just merely highlighting to you that in the minds of majority Muslim world, particularly people in Southeast Asia, which my colleague Ben Rogers have referred to yesterday, basing or having your basis of religious freedom on Article 18 of the ICCPR and the UDHR and all, it's not going to make sense. For example, for every of this covenant, the Muslim world have what you call a Cairo Declaration, which actually runs contrary to your UNDHR and ICCPR. So you can have a resolution. The Muslim world will have another resolution to counter you. I think that some of you are familiar with what you call the UN protocols. You will remember several years ago, the OIC tried to sponsor what we call the Defamation of Religion Resolution. Now, of course, it was defeated, but that was exactly the point. So, the critical issue when we come to religious freedom with respect to the Muslim world is simply this. There needs to be a renewed focus, a recovery or a reinvestigation of the basis for religious freedom, not so much from UN international documents, but from their own theological documents. I note yesterday, Dr. Travis Weber, in your speech as a moderator, you said that as far as the Christian community is concerned, one of the things that you would try to do was to recover a theological basis for religious freedom. Well, if the Christian uses the word theological basis, perhaps we can use the word Quranic basis for religious freedom in the Muslim world. So within the Muslim world right now, the critical issue is that what is the basis for religious freedom? There are Quranic basis for it. And with this, when we talk about a Quranic basis, we will go into the very complex issue of what is called the civilizational basis for Islam. But there are works that are being done. But and I think when we talk about this, re-looking at this basis, it is not just merely for Muslims itself. Non-Muslim community can get involved. Non-Muslim community must be involved in their process of rediscovering this basis. Otherwise, religious freedom will just become, at most, an illusion in the Muslim world. So, having that basis is a very important moment right now within the Muslim world. Secondly, as we relook at the basis for religious freedom, I think there is also a need to what we call empower civil society within the Muslim world. Empower civil society. And when I use the word civil society within the Muslim world, I'm talking about not just the academics, not just the human rights defenders, but the ordinary people, the women, for example. It's a very important component when it comes to the Muslim world. The ordinary folks in the street when it comes to advocating for religious freedom. Advocating for religious freedom does not just belong to the academic, the politicians, the diplomat, but the ordinary folks in the communities. Now we know that the development of and the genesis of the terror war, beginning from the time of Afghanistan, going into the situation of the 9/11 with Al-Qaeda, and then the rise of the ISIS, but ISIS is now mainly defeated in their territorial conquests. But the new phase, or the third phase, what scholars call the third phase of Islamic terrorism, is no longer in the entities such as Al-Qaeda, the organizations such as Al-Qaeda, or entities such as ISIS. But the new war on terror now belongs to what we call cell movement. Cell movement means that these are movements that are actually penetrating within the local communities, the ordinary people. The Sri Lanka bomber was not some high-flying, academician or political activist, but he was an ordinary person. In my country, in Malaysia, just a couple of weeks ago, the police arrested something like 7 or 9 suspected activists who was planning to actually, I think we are not sure, but he was actually planning to set bombs in places of worship. And we are told from the press that many of these people who intended to set bombs at places of worship were just ordinary people. So the terror cells has infiltrated local community people, and they are not targeting just the upper echelon of society, but the ordinary folks. So if we are to counter the extremism and to advance religious freedom, empowering civil society remains an important and critical agenda, especially within the Muslim world. Now, women, the empowering of women is a great opportunity. Many of the people in the Muslim world, within the Muslim world, the women are the one that is suffering, and they need to be empowered. They need to be educated what religious freedom is. That religious freedom is not something like a threat to their community, but will instead advance their welfare and well-being. So, first, basis for religious freedom, or relooking at religious freedom. Secondly, empowering the civil society, the ordinary folks like you and I. And the last but not the least, but there could be many more, but I'm just highlighting some critical issues. The third is this. We need to look at, or rediscover the initiative relating to inter-religious harmony, peaceful coexistence, and social inclusion. Now, I note that from yesterday's discussion, the experience in Europe may be different. But in the Muslim world, inter-religious harmony is a critical issue. Many of the so-called right-wing, ultra-conservative Muslim does not have an idea how they want to relate to the other. And that is because of their civilizational vision that they have come to embrace over the years. But inter-religious harmony is a critical issue. My colleague Ben Rogers SSC spoke about the situation in Indonesia. My country, Malaysia, is pretty much the same. There is issues of what we call identity politics. There is issue of what we call supremacist ideology, that Islam is the religion that is the best religion for all, and therefore all other religion must be subservient to Islam. It's an ideology mixed with political input. I'm not saying it's correct, but it's a reality. And therefore, if you have that sort of mindset, premise on that sort of ideology, what you will find is that you will begin to relate to others that are not of your own. You will begin to look at them differently. And when I say inter-religious harmony, I do not just mean Muslims and non-Muslims. I'm also talking about intra-relationship. We all know the Saudi-Iran war. Yes, much of it is geopolitical, but there is also the semblance of what we call the Shiite-Sunni dispute. And in any part of the Muslim world, whether China, whether Rohingyas, the Middle East, MENA, Southeast Asia, South Asia, the issue of Sunni-Shiite relation, inter-religious harmony, the issue of Sunni, say, and the Ahmadiyyas. In my country, the Ahmadiyyas are what the religious authorities in my country consider the Ahmadiyyas as not Muslims. Ironically, while they declare and they look at them as not Muslim, they haul up the Ahmadiyyas in my country under Sharia offenses. Now, if you are a Muslim, then you're under Sharia. But if you're not Muslim, why are you subject to Sharia penalties? But they do that. So intra-religious harmony is important. So not just inter-religious, but intra-religious harmony. And how do we relate to one another? And in the process of relating to one another, what sort of speech? Am I going to say things that is hurtful? Am I going to say things that are degrading? The issue of hate speech. Yes, Europe may have a different experience, especially the northern part of Europe or eastern part of Europe. But within the Muslim world, it is a critical issue. Inter-religious harmony, intra-religious harmony, hate speech, it's an issue. And so, the blasphemy laws remain. We've heard that in Pakistan, it's still there. But there arises another issue which the global community needs to look into, the so-called defamation of religion. The defamation of religion. And usually within the Muslim world, when we talk about the defamation of religion, it is actually in relation to Islam, not so much in relation to the other non-Muslim religion. How then do we relate to them? How then do we tackle this? How then do we address the defamation of religion? So, ladies and gentlemen, may I commend to you these three critical issues for discussion this morning: relooking at the basis for religious freedom from a Quranic perspective, empowering the civil society, the ordinary folks like you and I, and thirdly, how do we promote more inter-religious, intra-religious harmony, taking away hate speech, and removing blasphemy law. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yap. He talked about many issues, particularly one I'm trying to focus on inter-religion harmony. Yeah, okay. Intra-religion harmony. Yeah. So could I just try to invite Mr. Gu? Yeah.
I'm just going to check whether my presentation is up here somewhere. As we are sorting that out, I just want to start by saying a very good morning to all of you. Thank the organizers for inviting me to be able to share some things with you. And before I start, yesterday the indigenous group from the Army community talked about their impending harvest festival. As I stand here today, I want to recognize the indigenous people of my country, particularly the Kadazan group in Sabah, which are at this moment celebrating their harvest festival. And they are a recognized minority group, recognized with their own religion, some Christians, some others, but it's important that we acknowledge them today, and I do so. So I want to come back a little bit to the theme of topic 4 in your program, which is the global context and research on religious persecution. We've done a bit of a tour of the world from yesterday to today. Today I'd like to perhaps draw a few trends. And I'm focusing predominantly on Malaysia, my own country, but also Southeast Asia. And I'm sure those of you who are from outside those countries will have, as I put on the slides, have your own responses to some of the things that I'm to share. So, as a lawyer, my first basis is always start, well, what constitutes religious persecution? Most of the international documents, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, talk about what are the rights. So you have Article 18 in UDHR, you have Article 18 in the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And as you see the development of human rights over the years, in ICCPR you don't just have Article 18 on freedom of religion, you then have Article 27 that talks about minorities and the rights of minorities to have their own language, culture, and religion. So it becomes that added element to it. And then those are covenants, of course. Then you have a declaration, and here you begin to see the move towards trying to have a convention on freedom of religion, or at least elimination of intolerance, but it's not come to that yet. We've not arrived at that point. What we have is a declaration in 1981, and then a further declaration building on the minorities idea in 1992. But in many of these documents, what you will see are the exceptions. So you have the freedoms that are stated, and then you have the exceptions. And I think one of the speakers yesterday, or a few of them, referred to some of these exceptions. And just for a reminder, you have things like public safety, public order, public health, public morals, protecting the fundamental rights and freedoms of others, and then the UDHR in 1948 talked about the general welfare in a democratic society. So drilling down a little bit and looking at the UN Declaration on the Elimination of All Forms of Intolerance and Discrimination Based on Religion or Belief, these are some of the things that the declaration said that religions should enjoy, or adherents of religions should enjoy. Be able to worship, to assemble, and to establish and maintain places for such purposes, establish and maintain appropriate charitable humanitarian institutions, to make, to acquire, to use articles or materials related to rights and customs, to write, to issue, to spread, to disseminate relevant publications about religion, and to teach that religion in places suitable for such purposes, and then solicit to receive voluntary financial contributions. Then I want to pause there for a while and then look at where you would go to get the fundamental information on, if you were going to do research on religious persecution. Well, if your country is a member of one of the UN treaty bodies, especially on, let's say, the ICCPR, you'd have a periodic review, a regular review, where you'd have to make presentations to the committees to tell what has been done in your country, what's the situation in your country in relation to some of these. So the general ones on human rights, you'd have the Civil and Political Rights Committee and things like that. But then what if your country is not a member, so they don't show up? Malaysia is quite famous for the fact that, we've only signed 3 out of the accepted 9 international human rights treaties. So we don't sign the ICCPR, we don't appear before the committee. So we don't have to account for it. And even when you do sign, there are issues about late reports to treaty bodies, and all you get is a rap on the knuckles for not presenting your report, right? No sanction. International NGOs, local NGOs will have the ability to produce shadow reports, and that's available, and people can look at that. People can take advantage of the complaints mechanism to the UN Special Rapporteur system, and especially when we're talking about religion, then the Special Rapporteur on the right to freedom of religion or belief. And then there's a delay period of about 6 months, and then they publish all the letters that they have sent to governments raising questions about issues that have arisen. So you can look at that. Then, of course, ultimately, there's the Universal Periodic Review, which all countries in the UN system have to go through now it's about every 4.5 years. And you get comments about all areas of human rights, including freedom of religion. So this is a huge source of information that can be obtained. But again, even in the UPR, when there are recommendations made, there's no penalty for a non-response. Then, apart from all this, in terms of international bodies' reports, you have reports by foreign governments on human rights situations. So the US government produces a report about the state of human rights in different countries. You have USIF, and Tina is here. And then you also have third-party reports, Pew Research, Christian Solidarity Worldwide, Human Rights Watch. They will have all these things. But I want to, again, now focus on what exactly persecution means. And really, about the only document internationally that refers to persecution is actually the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And here in Article 7.2c, they talk of persecution means the intentional and severe deprivation of fundamental rights contrary to international law by reason of the identity of the group or collectivity. So when we're talking about religious persecution, the identity of the group or collectivity is its religious identity. But, and then what are the rights that are being transgressed? Then you look at all the international documents that talk about what are the rights that ought to be enjoyed in relation to freedom of religion. But then, lots of countries, and Malaysia is one of them, will have laws about freedom of assembly. They have laws about planning, zoning, when you have development. You have laws about land acquisition. You have laws about accounting and finance. You have laws about funds transfers, exchange controls, anti-money laundering. You have laws about customs and imports. You have laws of regulating freedom of expression, freedom of speech. In some countries, printing and publications. You have laws or regulations about education and schools. On the face of it, these may seem very innocent, very innocuous, and very secular in that sense. But all you have to do is to tweak some of these laws, and these laws can become acts and agents of persecution, right? So freedom of assembly. Can you meet? How many people can meet at one time? Do you need a license to meet, even for a religious service? Can you just build a church or a temple or a place of worship anywhere you want? And who decides where it goes? Who decides how the building is approved? In Malaysia, a building of a church or a non-Muslim place of worship needs the approval of the Muslim religious authorities. So you have one religion being in a supervisory or regulatory position over other religions. Is that persecution? It's a spectrum, I submit. It's a spectrum where at one end it's not persecution at all, but depending on how it's used can constitute persecution. So even in things like setting up organizations the laws about establishment of organizations, establishment of churches, the requirement that churches need to be registered in order to open a bank account, in order to have money. All that can be tweaked and tailored to constitute hidden, what I call hidden persecution. And of course, the subliminal messaging from these laws is that certain groups or certain activities may well be illegal, unlawful, or at least not appreciated. So let's go to some of the other sort of big picture problems. So in countries where there are constitutional monarchies, the head of state is also the head of official religion. So if you insult religion, or if you insult the head of state, you are deemed to have insulted religion. And that carries consequences. Likewise, when there is a state or official religion, same thing happens. And a lot of our constitutions, at least in Southeast Asia, not only provide for the right, but then also provide that parliament or the legislative body can lawfully make restrictions. So you sort of, in a sense, you give with the right hand and you take with the left. So a lot of constitutions are balancing. And what if you get that balancing wrong? So of course, the Constitution will allow laws regulating conversion, laws prohibiting hate speech, criminalizing apostasy, blasphemy, sedition, all these things. And then, as Eugene pointed out just before me, the connections then to race and religion and religious nationalism and identity politics becomes very, very important. So what we've seen in the recently concluded elections in India, for example, where religion featured very much as, this is a country of India. India is supposed to be Hindu, therefore the rights must go to the majority. And the minorities need to take their place knowing the political and religious landscape. So these are, now I'm going to go show you some 4 pictures. And these are perhaps specific to Malaysia. And this is where, in a sense, persecution becomes quite crazy. So the new government of Malaysia, which was elected on the 9th of May last year, made an announcement that it wanted to ratify the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And then what happened was that the Muslim NGOs, certain more right-wing conservative NGOs, decided that that would actually destroy or potentially destroy the special position of Islam in Malaysia. So out came 100,000 people on the streets of Kuala Lumpur saying, we want the government to reject, menolak is the Malay word for to reject, ISID. And he says the community, the Ummah, together with Muslim NGOs, reject ISID. You have another rally, and earlier this year, it's been for some time, again last year, the new government said it was considering abolishing the death penalty. And out came the Muslim community again. On the 3rd bullet point there, in Malay, bantahan kepada pemalsuan hukuman mati, that's protest against the abolition of death penalty. So something as innocuous as that becomes a religious issue because the argument is the Quran recognizes the death penalty. So to abolish the death penalty is to take away from Islam and therefore undermine the dignity of Islam. So out comes the community again. And then Malaysia again acceded, or at least deposited its instrument of accession to the Rome Statute. And out came the community again. So Himpunan Pertahan Kedaulatan Islam is a gathering to defend the dignity, the sovereignty of Islam. And again, you look at one of the bullet points on there, the Rome Statute. Why? Because the Rome Statute talks about no immunity, even for heads of states. So when you talk about constitutional monarchies, you talk about the kings and the sultans. They're saying suddenly, if these are people are the heads of the country, heads of the military, they have no immunity. And that undermines their dignity. And because the rulers are heads of the religion and of Islam, then you undermine Islam again. Out they come. And finally, something as innocuous as postage stamps, right? This is a postage stamp that was issued on the 11th of May, one of 5 postage stamps, to commemorate the bicentenary of an Anglican church in Malaysia. And after this was put up on Facebook, the comment was, oh, don't blame the West when they now identify Malaysia as a Christian organization or a Christian country because we're issuing stamps with churches on it. I mean, the other 4 stamps had a mosque, a Hindu temple, a Buddhist temple, but this becomes a rallying point. And if you want a closer view of the stamp, I have it here. My little show and tell for today. So you have crazy things like this being used to justify the claim that, we are being oppressed. So the Malay press, the Muslim press said, oh, this is proof now that Muslims are being bullied in Malaysia because we are issuing a stamp with the church on it. And of course, in Malaysia, we are famous for the earlier case a few years ago where the Bible in Malay language, where the word God is used, the Arabic term Allah, was actually banned. This is the latest edition of a Malay Bible. I haven't even opened it up yet. It's just been launched a couple of weeks ago. It has it's the work of 10 years of interpretation, of translation, and it has the word Allah in it. And they say that this is unlawful in certain parts of Malaysia. But this is a copy of a Malay Bible translated by a Dutchman in 1629 that already had the word Allah in it. So, to conclude, in Malaysia you have these issues, but at the end of the day, what we see is the politicization of religion, and then the partisanship and the prejudice of governmental authorities and even law enforcement agencies who see themselves as agents of the state. And if the state is predisposed to one religion, then the law enforcement authorities and agencies work in defense and in support of that, and in the persecution or oppression or suppression of things that are not in line with the official view. And when they act in an environment of impunity and a lack of accountability. Even things like when they arrest people and they die in custody, or in the most recent case in Malaysia, where there was a conclusion by the Human Rights Commission of Malaysia that 2 people who disappeared about 1.5, 2 years ago were actually taken by the special branch of the police force. And there's still been no accountability for that. So that's the end of my presentation. And I just want to round up by saying that religious persecution does happen. It's a thin end of the wedge. It comes in a very innocent guise in some countries, when laws and regulations are used to say it's about health, it's about planning. In Malaysia, you can't buy pork in the central market. You have to go to an off corner of the market to be able to do that, because to sell pork in the main market where everybody goes to would be offensive to the Muslims. So it's little things like that maybe for Malaysia and maybe for some countries we've come to accept it as a way of life, and we go on living. But for others, it would be a way of suppressing and oppressing different religious communities. And to me, that's an example of that fits the definition of religious persecution. So you don't really have to go very far to find real-life evidence if you're doing research about religious persecution in Malaysia, and I submit also in other parts of Asia. Thank you very much.
Thank you much, Mr. Goh. Thank you for mentioning several international human rights treaties, but I have to say, it seems like we live in an ironic society. Malaysia does not ratify these treaties, but in Taiwan we have the different problems. We want to ratify, but we are not accepted to ratify. That's very interesting. We cannot deposit our instruments of ratification to the Secretary General of the UN. So that's very ironic world we are living now. Yeah, but we have to first facing all these problems. So let me invite Mr. Abyss, I'm sorry, Ms. Morford. Yeah, Tina. Yeah, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'm glad that I'm following Andrew because I think my remarks pair really well with his, or at least I hope so. So as I seek to address our panel topic today, the global context on research and on religious persecution, there are three key questions that I want to ask and hopefully answer. Andrew was talking a bit about, these are the kinds of persecution that we're encountering, and so I want to tackle what do we do when we uncover it? What are we doing with that information? How do we approach that? So the first question, Eugene in his presentation, he talked about intervention. And my first question that I want to explore is, why is it so critical that we intervene when we encounter religious persecution? And by intervene, I mean intervene with like-minded governments to come up with strategies to address it, and also intervene with the governments who are permitting or tolerating or perpetrating the abuses themselves. The second question, why is it so important that we get these interventions right? So it's not just that we have this information, it's what we do with it. How do we present it? And third, what does it mean when a foreign government chooses to actually engage with us on religious freedom violations? How do we approach that? So on the first question about why interventions matter, I'm going to approach this through the lens of religion and politics. And some of you may be familiar with the perennial warning that people give out that, when you're going to a family gathering, avoid discussions of religion and politics. They're two highly charged topics, and they can be really divisive. And when you pair them together, it's combustible. So just don't do it. In some respects, this is the same thing in the diplomatic corps. It can be uncomfortable for diplomats to raise issues of freedom of religion or belief with foreign governments, particularly when there are other subjects to discuss that have more tangible results. A trade negotiation can produce a trade deal. Security talks can produce a defense agreement, etc. So why even bring up religious freedom or related human rights? Why should we be reporting these violations to policymakers? At the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF, we believe that people are entitled to religious freedom by virtue of their humanity, period. By extension, this means that religious freedom is broad enough and deep enough to merit an equal seat at the table with economic or security concerns. Human rights, including religious freedom considerations, deserve to be among the central concerns of foreign policy. So simply put, a country's interests cannot readily be separated from its values. And since its values reflect its identity, because religion, belief, or non-belief is an inextricable part of that identity, separating them would be nearly impossible. Moreover, it is false to assume that there's an automatic trade-off between religious freedom or other human rights and economic and security concerns. Both sets of concerns can work together in tandem in the real world. And in fact, USCIRF has observed that countries who respect and protect freedom of religion or belief tend to be more prosperous and stable over time. And quite frankly, this is exactly why USCIRF was created. Yesterday, Commissioner Manza conveyed the kinds of overarching recommendations that USCIRF makes, each of which reinforces the message that religious freedom should be incorporated in U.S. foreign policy. But what is it that actually underpins these recommendations? USCIRF was, quote, created by Congress to independently assess and to accurately and unflinchingly describe threats to religious freedom around the world, unquote. Independently, accurately, and unflinchingly. So independently and accurately are pretty self-explanatory. But what does it mean to unflinchingly describe threats to religious freedom? It means that USCIRF is statutorily mandated to look beyond the politics. And with laser-like focus, we highlight only religious freedom concerns without reservation about the overall diplomatic relationships. Now, be assured we're not reporting and making recommendations in a vacuum. We're not doing so completely untethered to reality, but we call a spade when others in the US government can't or won't. So, that said, why is it important to get these interventions right? As I was saying before, what do we do with this information once we have it? And to that, I would say, we are only as credible as the information that we report. And this applies to all of us across the board, whether you're in government, whether you're an NGO, whether you're a religious leader. For everyone, this following guidance applies. There's such importance in the credibility in the information that we collect and share. We're in a moment in time when there is greater US and global emphasis on international religious freedom than ever before. But that said, we're seeing a correlational spike in the kinds of abuses and violations that are described as abuses of religion or belief. Now, does that reflect an actual increase in the number of abuses that are occurring? Or are there certain abuses that are being described as such because they're, in a way, riding the coattails of something that happens to be really trendy right now? I don't say that to be critical, but I think it's something that we should think about and really reflect on what does it really mean to be a true religious freedom violation. And I realize that's not always clear-cut. Right? Oftentimes there are multiple issues underpinning a violation, and it's not always a black and white reason to see, is this religious freedom or is it not? But I think it's something we need to be all mindful of, and that's why I raise it. And so in our reporting, it's important that we not exaggerate the facts. It's important not to overemphasize the religion component just to make it seem more like a religious freedom issue when maybe it's not. The details of our reporting is really important. You can't get around it. There's no shortcuts here. The who, the what, the when, the where, the why. These are all critical parts of the puzzle. In an age of growing interest in targeted sanctions, this information is so critical. So it's important to gather data points not just about the victims of the persecution, but also on those who are perpetrating it. And that's so we can go back and see if they can qualify for a number of these targeted sanctions. More of them exist now today than ever before, but we need those data points in order to go after them. All of this, however, requires accurately sourced information. We're in a fast-paced news cycle. Everyone is racing to be the first to break news, but sometimes that comes at the expense of the quality of the information that we're sharing. There's nothing wrong with hitting the pause button just to make sure that we've gotten our facts right. Again, as I said before, we're only as credible as the information we report. There's an expression, I don't know if others of you from around the world will get this, but in the US there's an expression that says, all it takes is one rotten apple to spoil the bushel. And that means that it only takes one time to get called out on mistaken reporting to irreparably damage our credibility. And the information, as you all know, the information that we collect is made more robust when independent media and civil society are able to flourish and be part of the process. And we know in many parts of the world this is simply not the case. USERF's work, for example, would not be possible without the brave and poignant reporting by independent media and the detailed and nuanced stories collected and shared by civil society and the broader human rights advocacy community. And moreover, as I was noting before, in countries where one or both of these sectors of society are restricted, censored, or otherwise threatened, often so too are religious believers and non-believers. There's a definite correlation there. And certainly the lack of access to credible information is often quite telling in itself. USERF has regularly noted that the fact that there is limited information available about certain countries or that we don't report on them at all, does not necessarily mean that religious freedom issues do not exist in those countries, or that concerns discussed in previous reporting has improved. And I'll give you a specific example here. Just last month, USCIRF issued our 2019 annual report. And after its release, the Times of Oman, which is a newspaper, reported that USCIRF, quote, said that Oman is free of any form of religious conflict, end quote. So there's two problems with this reporting. First, USCIRF would never make such a declarative statement about any country, period. And second, USCIRF doesn't even report on Oman. But the newspaper, you can see, twisted the facts around and thoroughly misrepresented USCIRF's work to suit its own purpose. But having said that, as maddening as that may be, I would rather a newspaper or a foreign government make things up about our reporting and our work, like the Times of Oman did, than to have gotten the facts wrong ourselves. As a long-serving US senator once said, quote, everyone is entitled to his own opinions, but not his own facts, end quote. Foreign governments dispute the facts all the time because they deny the truth of what's happening in their countries, such as in Burma. They blame the international community for interfering in their internal affairs, such as in China, or because they accuse it of being biased, such as in India. That said, not all countries are quite this obstinate. So what does it mean, getting to my last question, what does it mean when a country does want to engage with the international community on religious freedom? Yesterday, Commissioner Mayenza listed a handful of countries whose governments took some action to improve religious freedom conditions, often through engagement with the international community. For example, Uzbekistan. In our 2019 annual report, we noted that the government of Uzbekistan has continued to publicly address religious freedom concerns in the country and engage with the international community. In 2017, the government welcomed a visit by the UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Religion or Belief, Ahmed Shahid. And then following that, in 2018, the Special Rapporteur issued recommendations that the Uzbekistan government then turned into a roadmap for further reforms. At the same time, the government pledged to rewrite its oppressive 1998 religion law. Nevertheless, while the government allowed greater access to religious education and more religious expression in the public sphere, it also continued to perpetrate a litany of religious freedom violations. For example, it continued to imprison Muslims based on arbitrary accusations of Islamist extremism. Thousands of individuals remain imprisoned. This is for charges of religious extremism or for being part of a banned religious group. There were new guidelines issued regulating the dress and appearance of students, which prohibits the wearing of religious clothing or symbols in the school setting, which includes hijabs, yarmulkes, and crosses. Minority religious groups like Protestants and Jehovah's Witnesses continue to face harassment from local authorities, and this is in the form of police raids, fines, the seizure of religious literature, education, etc. In recent years, USCIRF has made a deliberate point to underscore positive developments in our reporting where warranted. Praise and encouragement are an important element in helping foreign governments acknowledge that freedom of religion or belief is in their best interests. But for the sake of improved bilateral and multilateral relationships, both for the sake of improved bilateral and multilateral relationships and also for the betterment of their societies at large. And this reinforces my earlier point about credible reporting. If a country believes that your reporting captures the nuance of a situation and convincingly portrays multiple points of view, they may be more willing to engage. Now, I understand, this approach, USCIRF's approach, may not apply to everyone. You may not want to report on the positives. You may not agree that there are positives, and that's fine. For USCIRF, as a federal government advisory body, this is something we have to take into consideration. We ourselves may be independent, but the US government agencies to whom we make recommendations aren't. And so it helps for us, at least, to take into account a certain degree of statecraft when we are making recommendations so that we can effectively guide our own government. Now, as a side note, and again, in terms of the global context, Uzbekistan is one of several countries that points to the bad influence of its neighborhood as justification for the need to constrain what the government believes are would-be terrorists or extremists. In the case of Uzbekistan's neighborhood, they are, of course, referring to Iran and Russia. Now, in some cases, these kinds of fears are legitimate. Take the case of Tajikistan, where security and terrorism concerns are very real. Now, this is an important reality to keep in mind in our reporting and our monitoring on countries in similar situations. Nevertheless, it's still important that we approach these issues with a fair mind. You know, Tajikistan may genuinely face these threats, but its government exploits these fears to persecute political dissidents, critics, and non-sanctioned religious groups. These fears are never a justification for persecution, and we should all be prepared to say so in our reporting. We must call out this bad behavior no matter what neighborhood they may be occurring in. So as a very quick recap, because I know I'm out of time, you know, our work on religious freedom is far from finished. So we all need to continue monitoring and reporting on abuses and influencing policymakers on these issues. Second, you know, we help ourselves and the persecuted when we get our facts right. So I'll say it again, we're only as credible as the information we report. And finally, sometimes, you know, a lighter touch with foreign governments helps bring them to the table. But to be clear, diplomatic niceties and encouraging rhetoric are never substitutes for meaningful and lasting improvements to religious freedom conditions. Thank you to Bob Fu for being the Pied Piper who brought us all here. Thank you very much. And to all the other hosts and partners and sponsors, thank you again. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ms. Melford, for sharing the information and challenge and achievements of users to us. Now, could we welcome Ms. Tong as the next speaker? And I guess she'll be focusing on the situation of Falun Gong. Oh,
okay.
Yep. Thank you.
Actually, okay. Good morning. Back in Taiwan, I have been paying close attention to the persecution of Falun Gong and published 2 books for Gao Zhisheng 10 years ago. So far, I have collected data on China's organ harvesting for more than 13 years. There is always a question in my mind. By 1999, China did not have much expertise in organ transplantation. Why were they suddenly able to perform a large number of organ transplantation after year 2000? So, in year 2008, Mr. Ethan Gottman came to Taiwan and we had a show meeting. We met the first time. But I didn't know that he has interviewed Ke Wen-zhe, a doctor of National Taiwan University Hospital, specialized in trauma and intensive care. Here's the first keyword, the intensive care, the ICU. When Ethan's book, The Slaughter, released in 5 years ago, 2014, it opened the Pandora box for me. So 5 years ago, I worked with several friends who were experts in internet, and we collect Cole's essay, his 19 trips to China during year 2000 to year 2008. The medical equipment supplier called Medtronic, who cooperate with Ke Wen-zhe, and the data of China Military Hospital, as well as the essay China has published. We traced report about Huang Jiefu, the former Vice Minister of Health of China, whose major is organ transplantation, and found the second keyword, ECMO, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. Okay. The ECMO is being used in organ transplantation, and that's the keywords of the second keyword. I bring all the documents to Dr. Yan we co-work with several doctors and found the facts. The facts are, Cole was the first doctor who used the ECMO on organ transplantation. In year 2000, Cole was a young doctor and not famous. Why? CCP, that Cole entered the military hospital, and they call Dr. Cole the father of China ECMO. Why? CCP expanding the organ donor pool by using ECMO to protect organ instead of patients. Here comes the other words, non-heart beating donors. As you may know, after year 2015, CCP claimed that they have no longer used organs of the death row, but the number of the organ transplants has increased every year. Where the organ from? If not Falun Gong, who? Huang Jiefu said that the source of the organ were mainly from the intensive care unit and from the non-heart beating donors. Huang Jiefu also said that ECMO is the key for their great success in organ transplantation. Now, CCP began to harvest babies' organs and put them into adults' body. So, going back to my first point, the persecution is far away from us or just nearby. With ECMO, Taiwanese may also become victims. Here's the essay of Dr. Ko. Recently, one of my friends came to tell me and Dr. Yan that 20 years ago, his mother became an organ donor at the NTU hospital after the support of ECMO failed. He now wondered if his mother was really unretreatable, because according to Ke Wen-je's essay and the protocol of NTU, the non-heart beating is artificial, but not the will of God. She was not the only one. Perhaps my friend's mother will still die in the end, like every one of us. But this is God's will, and human beings should not interfere the past for any reason. Moreover, the evil method not only caused an increase in the crime of organ harvesting in China, but after the construction of the entire production line was done, the cannibal machine will not stop. And I see no reason that why CCP won't use the same method on Uyghurs today. Taiwan must keep our hands clean. Now, under the investigation of our Control Yuan of Taiwan, the truth is slowly exposed. We do not know the real figure of how many Taiwanese went to China for organ transplant, but the registered number is 3,000. These people went to China for organs, but they were the victim of non-transparent information too. So we must take action at once. Next, I will leave the time for Eastern government for more detailed report.
Thank you, Mr. Dong. So let's welcome Mr. Gottman to have further information on this very important and serious issue.
It's a great panel, and I'm very fortunate to be here. Can I move this? Okay, thanks. Just trying to get comfy here. Maybe I could move this a little bit too. Look, I really do appreciate being here, and I loved your comments, by the way. I really believe in hitting the pause button. In fact, I do it every day for like 3 or 4 hours, and then get back. Whatever. As the child of 2 American psychiatrists, that's a funny way to start something in a religious conference, and that is a mixed blessing, to be sure. I knew growing up that if a citizen of the Soviet Union, I'm quite old, did not agree with our government, they could be sent to a mental hospital. Now, my parents were not alone in their concern over the systematic torture of Russian dissidents. From 1971 on, the World Psychiatric Association routinely denounced their Soviet counterparts, and that went on to the end of the Cold War. And now guided tours of Soviet mental hospitals, which the Soviet Union offered up, were correctly dismissed by the West as fakes, Potemkin villages, if you will. And Soviet psychoanalysts were not welcome at Western conferences. They couldn't publish their findings in Western journals. There was no joint development of psychoactive drugs. There were no academic exchanges. Now, why did the Western psychiatrists, who were both liberals and conservatives, but mainly liberals, impose such a harsh, disrespectful ban to the Soviet Union? Well, because the West reached a consensus that the Soviet psychiatric system and their diagnosis of sluggish schizophrenia for anyone that they wanted to lock up forever represented such a dangerous perversion of medicine that reform was impossible, and isolation from the virus was the only option. Now, regarding the state-sponsored organ harvesting of Falun Gong, the trail of evidence begins in 2006 with the Bloody Harvest report by David Kilgore and David Matus. Now, in my book, I interviewed medical personnel on, among other things, the live organ harvesting of Uyghurs back in the mid-1990s. In 2016, we collectively released a 700-page report demonstrating that the mainland China's real transplant volume was 6 to 10 times above Beijing's official figures, and this was a numerical gap, as the New York Times put it, filled by prisoners of conscience. Now, since then, every major Western newspaper in the English-speaking world has reported on these findings in a serious way. The European Parliament and the US Congress have passed resolutions explicitly condemning mainland China's organ harvesting of Falun Gong, Uyghurs, Tibetans, and House Christians. Now, regarding the current status of House Christians, we really need new research in that area. We're going on something that's 8 years old at this point, and I'm happy to speak to anyone interested in this problem about that. Now, the only Western groups that are really actively denying the existence of this problem are the World Health Organization, which, as anyone in Taiwan knows, works closely with mainland China, and the Transplantation Society, which likes to think it works closely with mainland China. But despite mainland China's claims in 2015 to have reformed their transplant system, 2 years later, Beijing forcibly blood tested the entire Uyghur population, entire families, about 15 million men, women, and children. And in 2018, 1 million Uyghurs were incarcerated, which is apparently, according to various sources, risen to 2 million. Now, a dedicated live organ transplant lane was also established in the Urumqi airport. That photograph has appeared 4 different times, the last one being by a Japanese tourist, which I think it's fair to say it exists. Now, crematoriums are being constructed across Xinjiang. The first one hired 50 security guards at a wage of $1,200 a month, which is a fortune for that region of the country. In short, the proof, a smoking gun, if you like, was never really the issue. From harvesting death row prisoners, which Beijing admitted was routine, to harvesting prisoners of conscience, which Beijing denies, but doctors have admitted to me they were involved in as early as 1995, this was an easy step. This was an organic development. So we actually know more about mainland China's transplant hospitals than we ever knew about the Soviet Union's mental hospitals. And the precedent for a unified Western response to harvesting was established with the Soviet psychiatrists, and the only difference was the Western medical community's response to the crisis. Now, I'm going to speak very plainly here. The first reason for that response was a blatant disrespect for spiritual beliefs, particularly those of Falun Gong. For example, when the Transplantation Society representatives and their entourage, including Bishop Sarando, Chancellor of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, were touring carefully selected Chinese hospitals in 2017 and arranged visits, they left a trail of quotes. The Falun Gong fabricated the stories purely for political objectives. I haven't found any evidence whatsoever that there has ever been a Falun Gong practitioner who had been executed and had organs removed. We cannot let cults stand in our way. There was even a distant echo of this in Human Rights Watch, in their release of an otherwise brilliant report on the DNA testing of Uyghurs. Well, DNA testing of Uyghurs can technically be used solely for surveillance. Or perhaps, depending on the kit used, it can be used for surveillance and blood testing, that is, tissue matching for organ harvesting purposes. Human Rights Watch strangely neglected to mention that the Uyghurs were being simultaneously blood tested. Now, under the conditions of the transplant industry, as we understand them, blood testing is pretty obviously exclusively for organ harvesting, unless there's a SARS crisis or something like that going on. And there's no evidence of some sort of infectious disease in Xinjiang. Nothing. The Chinese haven't even tried this as an explanation. Look, why did Human Rights Watch do this? Well, I'm not in their office, but prejudice against Falun Gong, or perhaps just a refusal to finally acknowledge an issue that Human Rights Watch had avoided for over a decade, this led to increased Uyghur vulnerability. Now, the mainland Chinese understood the West. They understood, you're weak. You hunger for the contact high, the status that we can provide. You're afraid of our anger. You're afraid of causing offense. You're afraid of being seen in some way as intolerant. Most of all, you are afraid of missing out on the great financial opportunities of a China-run world. And to avoid being left behind, you will rationalize nearly anything. Now, the party also recognized that complicity requires an idealistic cover story. Nearly every Western actor held tight to a specific vision of their own actions as integral to the construction of a better and more just China. So the second reason for that response did not require a global conspiracy. The mainland Chinese medical authorities' rewards for complicity were localized, tailored, and they were curated for the Pontifical Academy of Sciences in Vatican City, the Transplantation Society in Harvard, Westmead Hospital in Sydney, a clique of heart surgeons in Berlin, the World Health Organization in Geneva, the Amnesty International Secretariat in London, a British architectural firm headquartered in London, a Swiss pharmaceutical company headquartered in Basel, and a prominent Middle Eastern actor, including its embassy staff. Yet all these disparate groups could only operate under one global precondition: dehumanization of the victim groups that were being harvested. So I'm going to close just to mention a new book. My role as an author in this new book is to shatter that precondition for the reader and to expose the culture of complicity that has grown up in my own society. The organ harvesting tragedy was created by Beijing, yet has been continually assisted by Western medical corruption by a handful of doctors who thought they could ride the Chinese dragon and come back home as if everything was normal. As I've made explicit in previous statements in Taipei, Taiwan is not immune to this. But with the intelligence and passion of the researchers represented in this room, I also believe that Taiwan is the heart of it's the beating heart of a solution. And look, I want to say, I know what I'm saying is controversial, and like most everyone in this room, I am a big tent kind of guy. I co-founded the International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse, ETAC, to bring in new blood, to bring in new experts from all walks of life and from all over the world to end the slaughter. But the world could not stop the slaughter of Falun Gong. So my new book, Complicit, will bring the story of Beijing's organ harvesting juggernaut and its Western collaborators to conclusion, which is millions of Uyghur Muslims incarcerated in camps, tortured, raped, blood tested, and on the edge of a human rights catastrophe. Now, even if we don't understand the currency here, I think the Uyghurs do. A Uyghur woman, Ms. Sultan's message to the Chinese authorities 1 month ago makes it explicit. Return my mother to me, and I'll donate my blood and kidney to you. My blood type is O, and I am 32 years old. Now, I want an end to all contact with the mainland Chinese transplant industry, including participation in medical journals, conferences, equipment sales, pharmaceutical development, and testing. I want consequences for global collaborators. I don't expect the Western medical world to immediately adopt these measures. Yet, if I've learned anything from my experience in Taiwan, it is that embarrassment changes policy. So I expect to start an argument, one that has been avoided for too long. And thank you for having me at this conference. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Goldman. I think our speakers have mentioned many issues. So therefore, I will now give the great task to our discussion, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you very much. I will also do without the platform. Ethan and I guess, have height in common. Well, thank you. It's a really great pleasure and privilege to be invited to respond to these 5 extremely impressive and important presentations. Yesterday, I had the challenge of speaking about 4 countries in 12 minutes. Now I have the challenge of responding to 5 presentations in about 10 minutes, but I'm glad to do so. And I should say that all 5 speakers are people that I have the privilege of working with in different capacities and are friends, and I work on the range of issues that they have covered. I thought I would just begin, before I get into responding to some of the points made, just by sharing a story that I saw on social media the other day, which was a story reportedly from China, where apparently a church pastor in China was asked to place a picture of Xi Jinping and a picture of another prominent key CCP leader in his church. So he placed them either side of the cross in his church. Picture of Xi Jinping on one side, picture of the other leader on the other side. And then he stood up and read the passage from the Bible that said that Jesus was crucified between 2 thieves. And I thought that was a very appropriate thing to do. I want to respond to the 5 presentations kind of in order, and the nature of being a respondent is that I didn't prepare anything in advance because I wanted to respond to what I heard. So I don't have a particular structure, but let me take some of the points that were made in order. One of the things that Eugene highlighted was the challenge of identity politics, particularly in Southeast Asia, in the cases of Malaysia and Indonesia. But it's obvious that identity politics is a challenge throughout the world. It's a challenge not only in the Muslim world, and Eugene was absolutely right to highlight the issues in the Islamic world, but it's an issue for example, in Burma with Buddhist nationalism, an issue in India with Hindu nationalism, and indeed a challenge in the Western world as well. So I think identity politics is one issue that we need to confront. Coming on to the issues that Eugene highlighted in the Islamic world, what stood out for me was the message that we need to empower ordinary people, civil society, and in particular women. And I think the link between women's rights and freedom of religion or belief is a link that is becoming ever more clear and ever more prominent. We ourselves in CSW are working on a report currently, which will come out in due course, on the issues of freedom of religion or belief that affect women and the link with women's rights. And I know the UN Special Rapporteur is also working on this issue. Eugene also brought to us the issues not only of interreligious harmony, but intra-religious harmony. And that very much resonated with me. The challenges both of Sunni Shia, the challenges for the Ahmadiyya community, but also understanding intra-religious issues in other faith communities as well. I remember when the crisis facing the Rohingya in Burma first began, I and a number of others tried to reach out to a number of prominent Buddhist leaders around the world to ask them if they would speak out as Buddhists. And we had some contact with the Dalai Lama and with a number of other prominent Buddhist leaders, and the Dalai Lama indeed did speak out. But I soon learned from Buddhist friends in Burma that it had absolutely no effect at all, because of course in Burma they are Theravada Buddhists, a completely different stream of Buddhism from the Dalai Lama, or indeed from some Mahayana Buddhist leaders in Southeast Asia who spoke out. And I realized that it was akin to asking a Shia to speak out about something Sunnis were doing, or hopefully these days are rather gone now, but in the past, a Protestant speaking to Catholics. So understanding those intra-religious issues as well as inter-religious is really important. And then a renewed focus, Eugene highlighted, on the theological and Quranic basis for religious freedom. I wanted to respond to that by mentioning that when I was in Indonesia last month, I had the privilege of meeting the Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Nahdlatul Ulama, the largest Muslim organization not only in Indonesia but in the world. And he's somebody who is really trying to do exactly this, to seek a movement within Islam that counters extremism and intolerance and promotes religious freedom. And he drew to my attention a number of documents which I would encourage you to look at. They're detailed in our new report on Indonesia, which is available on our website, released just 2 days ago. But one of the documents is the Nusantara Manifesto that was signed by Muslim leaders in Yogyakarta at a meeting in October last year, but also the Ansar Declaration on Humanitarian Islam, and a document that came out of the International Summit of Moderate Islamic Leaders, the Nahdlatul Ulama Declaration. The Nusantara statement says this: "We call upon people of goodwill of every faith and nation to join in building a global consensus to prevent the political weaponization of Islam, whether by Muslims or by non-Muslims, and to curtail the spread of communal hatred by fostering the emergence of a truly just and harmonious world order founded upon respect for the equal rights and dignity of every human being." I'd also draw your attention to the document that was signed by Pope Francis and the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar in Abu Dhabi earlier this year, and I will quote from that at the end. Andrew gave us an extremely helpful reminder of religious freedom in terms of international law and what the different rights spelt out are, and the international mechanisms and the role of civil society. One thought I had when Andrew was speaking about the protection from minority rights was that, of course, at the moment we should definitely be looking to protect minority rights, but a question formed in my mind, and this is a question based on things that different minorities in different countries that I work on have said to me, is that shouldn't we be working for a world in which actually no one is regarded as a minority, other than numerically, but rather as equal citizens with an equal stake in their country's future and equal rights. The definition of persecution that Andrew presented was very helpful, and I thought to myself that it was very important. This relates to some of Tina's points as well. It's very important that we don't use the term persecution lightly. Sometimes there are situations that are sometimes described as persecution, but would be better described as discrimination or as restrictions or as violations of freedom of religion or belief. We should only use the term persecution where the definition that Andrew presented really is appropriate. Something else that came out of Andrew's presentation was the intersection between different human rights, the fact that freedom of religion or belief can never really be seen in isolation. It almost always interacts with freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and other basic freedoms. And perhaps if we emphasize that more, that may help us to overcome the challenge that I think many of us sometimes face of the fact that religious freedom is often seen as an issue for religious people and an issue outside the mainstream of human rights. Our goal should be to mainstream religious freedom and emphasize that freedom of religion or belief is not a right for religious people, it's a right for every person, whatever their beliefs. And that emphasis on intersectionality is important. Also, I was very struck by Andrew's point about people coming out in the streets in Malaysia on different issues to, in inverted commas, defend Islam. And my two thoughts on that were that, first of all, I don't think that religions in and of themselves have dignity. This may be a controversial thing to say, but I don't think religions have dignity. People have dignity. And we have the right in our dignity to hold beliefs, but it should be the dignity of people, not of religions, that should be protected. My second thought on that was that if God is really God, then does he really need man-made laws and man-made movements to defend him? Isn't he the Almighty? And that leads me to an observation of sometimes paranoia in different communities. Andrew gave some examples. Another example I came across in Malaysia when I first started working on Malaysia was the example of the existence of halal shopping trolleys in supermarkets, which seemed an amazing concept. But similarly in other societies, in Sri Lanka, which I worked on years ago, there were various conspiracy theories that, for example, being put out by Buddhist nationalists, that, for example, Christians were making biscuits or cookies, as our American friends would call them, in the shape of Buddha as a deliberate insult to Buddhism. Well, no Christian was making Buddha-shaped cookies, and I certainly never saw them. But this was put out. Another conspiracy theory put out in Sri Lanka at that time was that when the Taliban destroyed the Buddhist statues in Afghanistan, somehow that was a Christian conspiracy, that Christians were in cahoots with the Taliban to do that. So the dangers of conspiracy theories and paranoia. And lastly, on Andrew's presentation, the politicization of religion, a major challenge, I think, in all parts of the world, and the role of law enforcement agencies in some places in defending the official interpretation, not just the official religion, but the official interpretation of religion. Tina highlighted, and I passionately agree with this, the importance of human rights, and including religious freedom, being a central part of foreign policy, being alongside trade and security. And I agree entirely with this. I think everywhere, the people who carry out persecution of religious communities are threats not only to their own people, but are threats to our own security as well. And they're also not reliable trading partners. They're very often, by definition, societies where there is no respect for the rule of law, where there is widespread corruption. So there is an interrelationship and a relationship to our own national interests between religious freedom, security, and trade. The importance of credibility of information. Again, I absolutely passionately agree with this. In the organization I work for, CSW, accuracy is absolutely number one. And I'd already made a note to say this, but Tina herself then said it. But I would say that for us in CSW, we are more interested in getting the information right than being the first ones out with the information. Credibility is absolutely essential. We try in CSW to have multiple sources. It's not always possible because sometimes there's an incident in an area where there is only one source, but we do try wherever possible to have multiple sources and always to check, to double check, and never to exaggerate. I also very much agree with Tina that when there are positive steps in a situation, it's really important to encourage those positive steps and to acknowledge them. I've always taken the approach with Burma, for example, that when the government and the military do what we would regard as the right thing, we're always quick to acknowledge it. Sadly, in the last couple of years, that hasn't been possible very often. But a few years ago, when President Thein Sein began the so-called reform process, I was very quick to welcome the steps he was taking when he released political prisoners, when he entered into ceasefire negotiations with ethnic armed groups, when the elections were held, when Aung San Suu Kyi won those elections. And so I think it's really important when the right thing is done to acknowledge it. It's interesting on the question of engagement. In CSW, we're always ready and willing to engage. But our experience varies country by country. So with Indonesia, for example, I have a very friendly relationship with the Indonesian ambassador in London and with some people in the Indonesian government because I know that the current administration in Indonesia, by and large, actually shares our concerns and is on the same side and in fact is potentially a target and a victim themselves of the perpetrators of religious intolerance. And so I have a very constructive, we don't necessarily always agree, but we have a very constructive dialogue. China, on the other hand, doesn't seem to like me very much, and instead of meeting me, they simply send harassing anonymous letters. So you take different approaches with different governments. Finally, on the question of organ harvesting, this is an issue that I've been involved with for the last 3 years or so. I've written quite widely on the issue myself. And I think it can be summed up in one very key question which was raised in the presentation. Where are the organs coming from? If they are not coming from who we believe they are, then why doesn't China open up to the world and be transparent and show us where they are coming from? But China's refusal to do so suggests they have something very big and very serious to hide. It's worth drawing to your attention, many of you know about this already, but there is currently a tribunal taking place, coming to its conclusion on the issue of organ harvesting. The China tribunal, chaired by Sir Geoffrey Nice, QC, who was the man who prosecuted Slobodan Milosevic, and on June the 17th, they will be presenting their final judgment. So it's worth watching out for that. If you're in London, you can come to the event in person, but you can also follow it online. And there is a website, chinatribunal.com. I'm looking at Andrew here, who has something to do with it, but chinatribunal.com. So I would recommend looking at that. And I think, last thing to say on that is, Ethan's next book, I think, poses a fundamental question. Not only where are the organs coming from, but what do we do about complicity? If we can't stop, and we should try as much as possible to stop it, but if we can't stop the practice of organ harvesting in China, we surely can at least stop, and we must stop, complicity with it from the outside world. Let me conclude just by trying to draw these different threads together with some words from the document I referred to earlier, signed by Pope Francis and the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar in Abu Dhabi in February. It's titled, "The Document on Human Fraternity for World Peace and Living Together." And I think these words are a good way to conclude everything we've heard this morning. Faith leads a believer to see in the other a brother or sister to be supported and loved. Through faith in God, who has created the universe, creatures and all human beings, equal on account of his mercy, believers are called to express this human fraternity by safeguarding creation and the entire universe, and supporting all persons, especially the poorest and those most in need. Freedom is a right of every person. Each individual enjoys the freedom of belief, thought, expression, and action. The pluralism and the diversity of religions, color, sex, race, and language are willed by God in his wisdom, through which he created human beings. This divine wisdom is the source from which the right to freedom of belief and the freedom to be different derives. Therefore, the fact that people are forced to adhere to a certain religion or culture must be rejected, as too the imposition of a cultural way of life that others do not accept. Justice based on mercy is the path to follow in order to achieve a dignified life to which every human being has a right. Dialogue, understanding, and the widespread promotion of a culture of tolerance, acceptance of others, and of living together peacefully would contribute significantly to reducing many economic, social, political, and environmental problems that weigh so heavily on a large part of humanity. The concept of citizenship, something that relates and is most pertinent today to the Rohingya people in Burma, the concept of citizenship is based on the equality of rights and duties under which all enjoy justice. It is therefore crucial to establish in our societies the concept of full citizenship and reject the discriminatory use of the term minorities, which engenders feelings of isolation and inferiority. Its misuse paves the way for hostility and discord. It undoes any successes and takes away the religious and civil rights of some citizens who are thus discriminated against. It is likewise important to reinforce the bond of fundamental human rights in order to help ensure a dignified life for all. And I think in the 5 presentations that we heard, that appeal to fundamental human rights came through very clearly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers, to achieve this great task to respond to all the speakers, which is such a limited time. And we also have limited time. I'm very sorry. I think we have go far beyond our schedule. So I have no choice but to adjourn this session at this point. I'm very sorry. And then we have more communication during coffee break. So let me adjourn this session. And please join me in thanking all our panelists. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you.